Hi everyone, and welcome to this video for language analysis, which is paper 1 question 2. And as you can see there, I'm going to be using the Hartop paper in order to practice this question today. It's been a while since I've done any language videos. I quite like language analysis, but I suppose that's what you would expect from an English teacher. So let's dive in. Question then is very specific. How does the writer use language here to describe the Hartop family? And I've highlighted that because clearly with these language questions there is a specific focus. All we need to say, or everything we should say, should be about the Hartop family and how they're described to us in these 7 lines of writing here. So we've not only got to stick to that box, but we've also got to make sure we stick to the focus of the task. As I always say to students, I say to them to cross off that third bullet point sentence forms, because in my experience with students, they tend to struggle to talk about the effects of sentence forms in the same detail that they would talk about the effect of an adjective, for example. So I would suggest that the 2 bullet points that have your focus will be words and phrases and language features and techniques. So we're looking then at how the writer depicts the Hartop family to us and what interpretations we have about them, what inferences we make about them based on the way in which they are described. So it says Hartop was driving. Hartop is obviously the father. A thin, angular man, starved face. He seemed to occupy almost all the seat, sprawling awkwardly, so that his wife and their daughter Alice sat squeezed up, the girl with her arms flat as though ironed against her side, her thin legs pressed tight together into the size of one. The Hartops' faces seemed moulded in clay, and in the light from the van lamps were a flat Swede colour. Like the man, the 2 women were thin, with a screwed-up thinness that made them look both hard and frightened. There's lots to work with in this section, which is usually the case with language questions. There's lots of lovely manipulation of language here. So the next thing we've got to do is annotate the devices. So I have here highlighted all the possible, or most of the possible words that you can look at. Some are phrases, some are words. We don't have a lot of language features or techniques. We don't really have many similes or metaphors in this section. So for me, the majority of the answer should be about that first bullet point, words and phrases. So we have words, we have an adjective to start, thin, which is then repeated, so we've got some repetition of thin. We've got Hartop being described in that list of 3, a thin, angular, starved face. So clearly the writer is trying to tell us about their way of life and how difficult it is for them to afford even things like food because of this hard work and this selling goods which they might struggle to make a living at. We've got the verb sprawling. The Hartop, the father, is described as sprawling across the seat, so clearly he's taken up a lot of room. And in contrast to that, the wife or the mother and the daughter, Alice, are described in those verbs squeezed up and pressed tight, which obviously contrasts with the sprawling idea. So Hartop, you could say, linking to his dominance and power in this extract, is taking up as much room as he wants, and yet his family are squeezed up and small and quite uncomfortably sat, which again you might say links to their powerlessness or voicelessness in this van. We have the verb ironed in there, her arms flat as though ironed against her side. So she's so kind of, they're packed into this van like sardines. They're so tightly packed in that it's as though somebody has ironed her arms next to her sides, and it gives this impression that she's quite oppressed. There's not a lot of room and it's quite uncomfortable. And then at the bottom there we've got the repetition of thin, but we've also got that phrase screwed up thinness. So again, we're constantly navigated towards this idea of being quite thin, and that's reinforced in this extract. So we have this contrast of Hartop taking up as much room as he wants, and the wife and Alice are kind of sat squeezed up next to him, which you could say alludes to his dominance. Okay, so those are most of the language words and phrases that you could look at if you were going to be answering this question. So in order to develop our ideas, we can develop our ideas by saying and taking into account these things. So the adjectives such as starred face suggest Hartop was not only malnourished and gaunt, but also possibly devoid of generosity and compassion. So he must know that his wife and child are sat uncomfortably in this van, but he doesn't really want to sit any differently himself, so he just lets them stay that way. So you could say he's not very generous and quite selfish, perhaps. As we said, you've got those contrasting verbs, sprawling and squeezed, to represent the different behaviour within the family. So the mother and daughter are quite, are quite oppressed, you could say, but the father, Hartop, is very powerful, and that shows different personalities. As we've just said, the recurring motif, or the fact that thin or thinness is reinforced through that repetition, to describe Alice and her mother, but also Hartop as well. The fact that none of them seem to be able to live in luxury, and perhaps they don't have a lot of money, and that's why they don't have a particularly, luxurious lifestyle. They're quite malnourished, and you could say that's quite ironic, seeing as they sell food and produce, perhaps. You could say the powerlessness or the voiceless nature of Alice and her mother in comparison to Hartop's dominance and authority. He's taken up as much room as he wants. There's a sense of oppression and suppression created by the way they are seated. The Hartop family showing they don't live a life of luxury and have little money, shown through their thinness. The reference to clay to describe their facial expressions, suggesting life is hard for the family. They're kind of very stoical, but they have to be kind of hard faced in order to survive. And also Alice and her mother's acceptance of Hartop's behaviour, the fact that they don't really challenge him to, sit differently. They just accept it. They accept being kind of tightly compacted in this van. So those are all points that you can use to develop your ideas for AO2, which is really what this assessment objective is looking at. So now let's look at the mark scheme. There's 4 levels. Obviously this is paper 1, so the top mark is 8. And you can see that we go up in 2s for each level. And you don't have to hit every single one of these bullet points in the level to achieve it. But obviously in order to get 8 out of 8, you need to hit all of the bullet points in level 4. And what your teacher will do often in marking the work is they will use these words that I've highlighted in different colours to almost signpost you to the correct part of the mark scheme. So in order to get a level 3, for example, your writing has to be clear and show a clear understanding. To get level 4, it has to be perceptive and detailed, and so on. So your teacher will often choose one of those highlighted phrases to begin with, and then see where you sit within that level. Okay, so in order to get level 4 or the grade 4 to 9, you need to get obviously top of level 2, 3, and 4. Okay, you'll probably not get the GCSE if you hit 1, 2, or 3 marks out of 8. So it's always a good thing to aim for half marks. So for this question, we need to make sure we use some terminology to expand on your ideas and also quote. So those 3 bullet points, which are quite what you would expect really with a language question. So I'm going to start by showing you a level 2, and this got 3 out of 8. So just below really where you need to be to comfortably get the grade 4 or above for that GCSE in English language. So the student says the writer uses a different range of words to describe the Hartop family. The family are described as skinny, but the father is described as rude and skinny. Both of these reasons are shown in lines 6 and 7. In line 6 it says a thin, angular man, starred face. This tells the reader that the man is rather skinny. In lines 7 and 8, the writer says he seemed to occupy almost all the seat, sprawling awkwardly, so that his wife and their daughter Alice sat squeezed up. This implies to the reader that the man does not care about anyone but himself. So we've got some simple analysis in there at the bottom there, but you can see that the quotes are too long. They've spent too long copying rather than analysing. So for this question, I would always suggest do not copy large chunks of text. You also don't need to worry too much about stating the line numbers. They've worked quite hard here to be very exact, but that isn't analysis either. So I would not even mention line numbers, and I would keep quotes to to quite short quotes, 1 words, 2 words, not whole chunks like this. However, 3 out of 8, almost half marks, but not quite enough in order to comfortably get the grade 4 to 9. Okay, so that's level 2. Level 2 again, this time half marks, so half marks, top of level 2. The writer uses language here to describe the Hartop family. He begins by describing Hartop the driver with the rule of 3, a thin, angular man, starred face, with powerful adjectives to portray how thin he was because of a lack of food. He has a starved face. We also see how he was greedy and inconsiderate. He seemed to occupy almost all of the seat. He wasn't leaving much room for the rest of the family. The writer uses emotive language to show how he was doing this, sprawling awkwardly. The writer describes Alice with her arms flat as though ironed against her side. This simile depicts how still he was and how little room she had. We also get the impression from the simile how obedient and didn't try to protest. Moulded in clay, this metaphor, as well as the description of flat swede colour, makes their faces seem lifeless. Even though the man seems to be the boss here, with the others following and not protesting, they did have a similarity. Like the man, the 2 women were thin. This made them look both hard and frightened. The writer uses emotive verbs to show how they were feeling and to suggest they had something to be frightened of. So half marks, we've got some nice methods in there, rule of 3. There's a little bit more detail about effects on readers or interpretations. But again, not sophisticated enough to get levels 3 or 4. Okay, so if you wanted to get the grade 4 or half marks, then you would have to write something like that. Finally, level 4, 7 out of 8, and as you can see, the student has gone into a lot more detail just by the amount of text, and this is quite impressive, obviously, to do in 10 minutes. Which is what you've got for this question. So it says the writer uses language to describe the Hartop family as perhaps struggling to make ends meet because of the work they do. Bates uses references to Alice's arm being flat as though ironed, which suggests she isn't sitting comfortably. This is reinforced by the adjective squeeze and phrase legs pressed tight together because her dad seems to be taking up all the room on the seat, seen through the verb sprawling, which reinforces his dominance in the family and how Alice and the mum are powerless in comparison. The verb ironed has connotations of a laborious, drudging task, often a task done by a lower class worker who would get paid pittance. This may be a reference to the job Alice and her family are doing. They are very poor and work hard at the laborious job of persuading others to buy their produce, even in poor weather, but have little to show for it. Ironed may also be a reference to how tightly her arms are pressed to her side, since you would iron clothes which up very little space at all, so it creates feelings of oppression and claustrophobia. Some slight inaccuracies there from the student, but very impressive effects and methods here. Furthermore, Bates uses repetition to emphasise how the family are struggling. The repetition of the adjective thin draws the reader's attention repeatedly to the idea that the Hartops may not eat much food, and just as they have very little space, they have very little money for food. This idea is reinforced with the phrase starved face, implying the Hartops are malnourished, linking with the idea they are not very well off and can't even afford human fundamentals like food. Finally, the writer uses language to describe the Hartop family with the phrase moulded in clay. To me, this creates an image of a rather expressionless, severe face, showing the signs of a hard life. Clay has connotations of a statue and its stone-cold, hardened expression. The family appear to have been hardened to this inequality and laborious work, which is not dissimilar to slave labour. Moulded implies that a higher power is involved, as if the family are powerless to escape this kind of impoverished lifestyle. So, as you can tell, that's very impressive, and lots of lovely quotes, lots of methods, and some very detailed and perceptive analysis as well. They've really taken this task by the bull by the horns, and they have really kind of confidently put in some analysis there and what they think. And it's okay to use phrases like "to me" or "I think," because the examiner wants to know what you think. This is your exam, this is your analysis, this is your interpretation. So don't be afraid to mention yourself in the analysis if you want to. Okay, so that would get 7 out of 8. I suppose there is argument there to give that full marks, but AQA gave this 7, so I've just copied them. Okay, so that is this Hartop language question. Make sure that you spend 10 minutes on this, and make sure that you have short quotes, you're referring to the methods where appropriate, and also making sure you go into as much detail as possible in terms of your effects and interpretations. Thank you.